So it's a really great pleasure to have all four of you here with us, to have Manuela Moscoso, who's the curator of the upcoming Liverpool Biennial, to have Martin Guinard, who's the co-curator of the current Taipei Biennial, which is on now in Taipei, and Filipa Ramos, who was co-curator of the current Shanghai Biennial, and then leading us today and bringing everything together is Rafal Niemojewski, who's director of the Biennial Foundation.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for everybody for joining us this morning. So this discussion, I started thinking about it. I just finished working on a book, and I sent it over to printers actually just last week. And this is sort of the pandemic project, really, somehow enabled by the pandemic, taking a lot of distractions, and also including travel and visiting biennales around the world, making it impossible. So, but the book was about biennales and about discourses that and different questions around the biennales that actually been there already from the 90s. And one of the things that I was thinking while working on this book was specifically, how much credit to give the pandemic. And I made a quite conscious choice, which I may regret in the future, but not to give too much credit. I was thinking, what if somebody reads that book 10, 15 years from now, when all this will feel like a distant past? And I think what is really interesting that question about the future of biennials and some of the questions that we're going to discuss here, they all actually been around for quite a long time. I would say since the mid-90s. Just to remind you that biennials been very positively received in the beginning, but I would say around 2000 especially, we witnessed a lot of negative criticism. Already people asking question, isn't there too many biennials? Is the system, is it sustainable, the whole ecosystem? And there are a lot of questions, regarding the fragility of this ecosystem and some of the side effects of globalization also that have been always very close to the discussion relating to biennials. So my idea is generally that, that pandemic, and of course, we're going to be talking about this context today because we're still stuck in it and there is no way to escape it. But I would like to think about it and frame that discussion, that about the issues that already been present. And I think they sometimes they basically been highlighted by the current situation, but they are pre-existing issues and they're just reminding us about the fragility of the whole ecosystem. But I would like to just start, I shared with you my vision, but I would like to ask our speakers if this is a similar way, where you think it has been going while actually working on biennials during the pandemic. Do you think this episode will actually produce some substantial permanent long-term effects? And also, should we expect it to? Do biennials need to change? And if they do, in what ways? So I wonder what your thoughts, given your recent experiences. Maybe we can start with Filipa.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Rafal, for bringing us here and bringing us together. And by going straight to the point of the important question, which is the continuous existential crisis of biennials, in a way. Obviously there's no straight answer to your question. What I think, exactly continuing with this past future temporality that Brian was alluding to in the when he was asking what was the future of biennials, what I think is that regardless of the virus, that, by the way, risks to be the chief biennial of 2021 if it's going to reign for 2 years, as it seems, inverting the notion of something that repeats every 2 years, but actually lasting for 2 years. everyone or many people whose professional activities relied heavily on traveling, both in terms of outcome production and consumption, because they're very related. Thus produce to consume and consume to produce, in a way. I'm thinking about culture and art. Were complaining in relation to exhaustion, physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion, lack of resources, excess of traveling. And so this malaise, let's say, with the excess of mobility and excess of offer has been going on for a long time, and of course has been fed by this growth of international manifestations that ask for your attention, ask for your presence, and then that ironically this sense was even reinforced by social media, in a paradoxical way, in the sense, instead of thinking I don't need to go because I have access to the most interesting projects or to opinions or to forms of criticism, it's almost the opposite. It's like, oh, I'm missing this, no? And so in one way or another, this microorganism has forced us to just like stop and rethink, what are we doing, for whom are we doing this, and how to move ahead. So I do think that some of the most interesting proposals are those that are actually trying not to replace the actual physical experience by simply transferring things online, not acknowledging that there needs to be a radical transformation of format for you to export cultural production onto a completely different disembodied support. And those challenges, and I think we're going to touch upon this soon, can be really important for us to rethink what we're doing. I actually think that this situation may help us to get beyond some, in my very personal opinion, some horrible jargon like international art or international artist. What's an international artist? What's international art? I mean, the Tate calls their curators curator of international art, and I think this will also the absurdity of these expressions like this one. It's not only the Tate, I'm talking about the Tate because I know better, will be radically rethought, revised under the current situation. And I think that, yes, as you mentioned, the virus accelerated the process, highlighted a discontent that was already there. And I think it needs a lot of courage. It's also a bummer, as we all know, but it may bring some really important transformations that, yeah, as you said, that were needed. I was very general. Maybe we're going into more nitty-gritty things afterwards.
Okay, Manuela.
You're muted.
I think you're muted.
I was trying to think, I mean, the experience that I'm having in the Liverpool Biennial and also in comparison when I did the Cuenca Biennial, which are two different, very different types of biennial. And in a way, I mean, although all those criticisms, that's, you know, of course, international, like, you know, the other day I had a question in an interview was like, were you worried to invite global artists? And I was like, you know, how do I answer this? Because you have to get out of those, you know, rabbit holes. And but I think, I mean, although I understand this kind of sort of, I mean, there is this idea that kind of circulation is the most important thing about art. You know, like the more circulate, the more touch points. That's what creates value and creates, you know, name and creates, you know, like kind of mends and amplifies the sort of the importance of practices. At the same time, I think biennials do a different sort of And possibilities, they also are like, because they are fast, and you are like, when you are producing a biennial, I worked before in a museum, it's like a very slow machine. The monster of a biennial is very fast, you know, you can actually, you know, meet somebody, immediately invite them, you know, and immediately be producing something with them. So that creates some sort of a different type of texture. And I think also because it creates a different type of texture in certain contexts, that's what, you know, it's really appreciated. You know, that you have like the possibility of having some sort of gathering, you know, like a real time almost gathering of things that are happening. So you are kind of talking at the same time that you are producing, you know, like talking, thinking, producing at the same time. And that's like kind of, I think it's the sort of potential of a biennial. And in contexts which are not big cities specifically, I know that, you know, for instance, Liverpool and Cuenca both are mostly financed by the city. But not only. So there is like an interest about, you know, this Liverpool Biennial, all of them are like linked to a city. So somehow, you know, there is like all this desire from the city, from the governments to create some sort of, you know, outdoors to the world of like a portal to the world of what that city is. For I think local contexts many times is the possibility to see art as well that is produced now, because there is no real, you know, there is no museums and other cultural centers, not necessarily Liverpool, but in Cuenca as well. So at the same time, they are complicated and can be tiring. And you know, this I think is a problem most of us than actually from the biennials, that we are like kind of, oh, why did, you know, what we have to go? That's more of a symptom of us as humans than rather than the biennials as a form, I would say. And that, I think, that's what the virus is telling us. Maybe the way that we consume things and produce things as well is not only, you know, is not only about the things themselves, but the relationship that we have been building with the things that we are producing. And the way that we have conceived normal to travel, or you know, the sort of normalities that we have constructed around us in order to operate. So I think that's what, for me, the virus is really, really clear, like how we are just constructed and how we can have to maybe deconstruct or relearn certain habits. And in terms, like, I'm totally with Filipa, this, you know, like then it becomes, this is perhaps, we have felt it a lot, you know. So you're doing this huge enterprise because it's like, you know, you have so many people involved to do a biennial, so many desires that you have to negotiate, you know, so many different partners, stakeholders, funders, you know, that you are like putting everything together for one moment. It's like a lot of balance. So when the biennial has the possibility, you know, like suddenly the biennials are maybe not going to be open, the desire to have a presence is, you know, the anxiety, and, you know, it's immediately online. It's like, what can you do online? And I think it's impossible because the work hasn't been produced for, you know, it's not an element that was, in my case, for instance, it was not something that it was produced, you know, like with that type of conditions, not the pandemic, not the online as a condition that had to be embedded within the making of a biennial. So it's impossible to translate it. It's impossible to try practices like that. It's to unfair artists as well, to ask them to do that. And that, I think, exhaustion comes from there, especially, you know, like this exhaustion of trying to get somewhere without really ever being able to kind of, you know, make it happen properly. But I leave somebody else, so we can then.
Martin, are you, thank you so much, Manuela. Martin, are you a biennial enthusiast or are you more of a skeptic?
As like that, like, of course, no, there is an enthusiasm about creating a biennial, at least in the Taiwanese context, because, I mean, you know, the fact that we were able to have that biennial in an almost normal way was something which we could only rejoice about, of course. But there is something where there are process, you know, between biennial and banal, you know, like you could almost make a bad pun on biennalities, you know, like the kind of common thread that can happen very, very often, and which are very often due to an organizational structure which names a curator 12 months or 8 months sometimes, or even sometimes like 6 months before, and which then doesn't give much time to do a proper kind of research, a proper kind of interaction. In the case of Taiwan, I must say, like, we were super spoiled because we were nominated 2 years before, which gave us the time to go there, understand a bit the dynamic, and you know, Taiwan specifically has this thing that is very interesting for this biennial and the multiplication of biennials in Taiwan, actually, but the Taipei Biennial specifically, which is to deal with the kind of deficit of exchange that the Taiwanese have, and really within the civil society as a whole, like the fact that there is no recognition of Taiwan, the fact that it's kind of isolated, and therefore that cultural places, whether they're biennial or not, can become great tools to create that kind of discussion and that kind of dialogue. And that also, you know, like the biennial becomes then this great platform in order to give meaning to this word, which, you know, can sound like a cliche, which is the cultural dialogue. Usually when you hear cultural dialogue, you can think, okay, yeah, like that's kind of you know, very approximate, yeah, like a banal way of describing what the aim of a cultural institution is. When you're in the context of Taiwan, it gets a very specific flavor, in the sense that there is so much expectations for getting those kind of opportunities that really you feel that that it's a fantastic platform, under the condition that you have the time to do some research, so that you can actually give meaning to the kind of productions that you have, and that you don't just bring a list that was a pre-existing one, which kind of fakes an interaction with the local scene by integrating 1 or 2 or 3 local artists. I mean, that's really the wrong way to do it in a way. But so I would say, like, that there is a possibility, like Filipa, you were talking about the fact that the COVID has given some time, and what I really hope is that it's given some time for people to stop and think about the kind of content that they want to produce, and how that content can be really not plugged in, but actually grow from the problematics that are local. Otherwise, there's not that much of a point of making those big mega exhibitions.
In relation to that, what I think, if we read the reviews of most large exhibitions for the past 4 or 5 years, which is something I was doing very intensively while I was working at Art Agenda and IFRANC, there's such a dissatisfaction and such a level of criticism. And of course, you have to think that writers and art critics are under stress. They have to see these major shows that took years to make in 1.5 days. Then they have to write at night around the clock when they actually wanted to be partying with their friends that they haven't seen, and so on. So there's this stress that emerges through the critical reception of these exhibitions. But at the same time, the virus just made us desire, or at least I'd speak for myself, created the desire for art that I haven't seen in many years, and enthusiasm for something. And I mean, without being cynical, this is already incredible, considering how so many people were like, oh, another, rolling eyes and not enjoying exhibitions, and even not having time to think and to work and do this. So hopefully, at least, I mean, it's a very, very thin silver lining, but yeah, hopefully that.
That's true. That is, yeah.
Just one thing in terms of like the list and plugging in, I think it has to do with ethics of curating, actually. It has to do not only with biennials. I mean, in biennial, I think the pandemic it's maybe showed more, you know, but I think it's like about research and taking seriously the invitations, you know, like I think that's what is important in any project that you do, be a biennial or an exhibition in an artist run space, you know, that it has to have some in-depth, you know, engagement. Like it has to have, like, you know, you have to care for that, you know, you have to really want to contribute. And I feel like you really notice when our biennials, because, you know, they are bigger, so all the problems get bigger. But I think that's something about curating in general, I would say.
So Manuela, that brings me to the question, you know, that I would like to ask you, and it's a tough question. Excuse me, it's a tricky question, but you know, it's about thinking also to what extent, you know, we sort of articulating some of the problems, but to what extent we are part of the problems. And I know it's a difficult thing to reflect on, but I'm sure you all have done it, you know, that you as curators, and I'm not even talking about those recent biennials that you work on during pandemic, but in general, you know, coming from one country, going to another country, one of the big criticisms that people say, and I'm not even gonna sort of trying to argue here whether it's a funded criticism or not, but it's about biennials being the force of a homogenizing force when it comes to curatorial practice, and when it comes to artistic practice as well, by the fact that, you know, that people are moving, they're spreading certain ideas, and you know, effectively working, curating an exhibition in a completely different part of the world, do you ever feel that you're sort of part of it, you know, given that you have to that you know, that are not sort of local and indigenous to that culture? Do you ever sort of have this kind of self-critical reflection that to some extent, you know, you may be also part of the problem? I know it's a tricky question, so but I was just wondering if this is something that crosses your mind.
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. It's just, of course, I'm not the right person to answer it, in the sense that I'm sure that some, you know, like Taiwanese audience would be much more appropriate to pinpoint that part. But there's a very big difference when you arrive, especially when it's in my case, where you arrive with like a prominent philosopher, Bruno Latour, to say, hey guys, like the point of creating an exhibition like that, it's not to teach you anything. There is nothing about teaching you. It's about raising some questions. It's about posing some questions and making an experiment. And actually every kind of like, let's say, bits of experiences that people are going to get are going to be valid ways of you know, deepening the question. And so I think that, you know, like a moment that was pretty important for us is like when we're in the preparation, we, like a year and a half before the biennial, we went to Taiwan and we had this meeting with like various scholars and artists, and we did a sort of crash test of our concept to say, okay, like how can you voilà, is what we're talking about, is it relevant for the Taiwanese situation? And that was really great because we had plenty of fairly honest answer, because it was a closed door meeting, but from people who were saying, well, actually, this doesn't seem to be that relevant to talk about this, whereas that is something that you're not discussing. How do you, you know, where do you, like our theme was about the fact that we live on different planets because of ecological division that have been so deep. And you know, like somebody started to ask us, okay, where is Taiwan within that? Well, that you know, like this kind of moment in the preparation where you come to set up the parameters for an experiment, and not to come to deliver some sort of knowledge in a very, you know, like a didactic way, makes the whole difference, I think, for the approach. And that's one way not to escape that problem, but at least to avoid some of the most annoying parts of that process that you're describing.
Filipa, may I just ask you also in relation in particular to ecology, you know, how does it feel, you know, if you are going to curate a show that deals with problems of ecology, but then you have to create all the carbon footprint by flying there. You may know that the catalog for the show will not necessarily be printed on recycled paper. How can we actually address those issues and work it from within?
That's a question that is very much at the heart of my concerns. I should also, just before answering your question, I think it's also important not to romanticize localism, because I think there's a difference between a biennial existing, being locally grounded, and doing an activity, developing an activity that makes sense for a certain environment throughout the time. Liverpool Biennial is a good example of that. There are others. I mean, when I was teaching in Venice, I saw how Venice exists beyond the, also because it has something happening every year between architecture and art and theater and cinema and so on and so forth. Of course, they are events, they're major events that have a fundamental role in the touristic income of these places, but still they are rooted, and they don't only appear and disappear in events, or they don't work like an European itinerant seller that does a biennial here and there and in different places and creates a necessity that doesn't exist and then disappears and leaving people wanting for something that doesn't exist anymore. So I think the institution itself, if it's locally rooted, the relationship with the international in the provenience of different curators also changes, no? And I think it can be really interesting because it's people who, as Manuela said, when they have a certain ethos, they are committed to stay, research, dialogue, and establish forms of shorter and longer relationship that can exist also beyond the temporalities of the biennial, meaning before and after. Now you're touching upon, with your concerns with ecology, you're touching upon a really fundamental issue, which is accelerated traveling, and traveling not only of people but of materials, and of infrastructure, of everything. And that is in fact a very painful topic. I should say that for a very direct reason, flying became the kind of the bastion of ecological thought of the cultural world. And sometimes we're invited not to travel, not to fly, but to take the train. And no one asks me, what are my consumption choices? What are my food choices? What are the transports I use every day to move around? So I think I would also like, and even if I can be very easily attacked by this, I should also say that for me, flying is a crucial issue, there's no doubt, but it's not the only element that we should take into account when thinking about the ecology of a biennial. And other elements that you're highlighting should also be taken into account: the recyclability of materials, the ecology of being. If I go there, will I go for one day, or can I go for 10 days and be part of the social, the cultural, the educational life of a reality, spend time there? My travel will be the same, but my time will be different, and my involvement will probably justify, without being cynical using this word, the presence and the participation of individuals in different places. So I do totally hear you, and I think it is an issue that probably will be resolved by the forced slowing down that we're all being exposed to. And I think it's also inviting us not to resume to the way things were before, but actually change the processes in which things are being made and slowing them down. And then just rethink ecology in also more original ways than just the air miles, which are hellish, I agree, but are not the only thing. And again, rooted biennials, rooted institutions are really important and can assure that then there can be a circularity of people coming from different areas, some local, some not, and establish dialogues that are fundamental for even for our imagination to continue operating.
No, but I mean, like, ironically, one of the few people I could bring to Taiwan was an artist, but also an environmental engineer called Stéphane Verlet-Bottero. And he did this, all research on what was the biggest consumption factor of CO2 for a place like the Taipei Fine Art Museum. And actually, transportation, on which I've been putting so much pressure on the administration to use boats as much as possible, etc., was only about 5%, whereas keeping the place at right temperature was amount of 90% of the CO2 emission, because they're depending on a cold grid. And then, like I had put so much emphasis on how we were going to bring everything via boat, whereas that was just the wrong fight. It's like putting that money in solar panels would have been much more interesting and efficient. So first, it's like learning to count. You mentioned the catalog. The catalog is counting for peanuts in terms of the CO2 emissions. So like first learning to like working with people that are willing to understand better that actually like where is the enemy in terms of CO2, where it's based, and that it's really not where you would expect it. Then, I mean, one of the things that I, liked about the COVID situation was that it solved a contradiction for me in the sense that, the biennial was no more a tool for international tourism. So you didn't have all that CO2 based tourism. There's thousands of people coming every day to see the show. It's really rejoicing to see that the Taiwanese audiences are coming because they're super excited about seeing that Taiwan again has a possibility to integrate itself within the making of a country culture. Also, like out of curiosity, okay, what is, what are Mexican artists doing on this problem? What the, like this diversity really that people can rejoice from it, but really like a kind of local audience. I think that's in a way a huge success. Of course, I'm sad that, Brian and Filipa and you or Rafal don't come to see the show and give feedback on it, but at least not having the guilt of the carbon on my shoulders of all that production of tourism, which biennials are part of, is sort of a relief, I must say.
Manuela?
So, okay, so it's about, because we talked so, so broadly, I mean, I think again, it's about like the sense of engagement, I think has to do with ethics and forms of making, like the methodology, because I mean, at the end of the day, we are talking about exhibitions, and exhibitions, let's say more or less, like they have certain language, it's objects, things in space, so they can look alike. However, the way that you do exhibitions is what is important, like the methodology, which, which is kind of very difficult to describe and very difficult to create a lot of literature around it, but what will create the difference. So for me, let's say, when I was invited to Liverpool, I was working in Mexico, and I was invited to live in Liverpool to do the biennial. I was like saying like, but you come, and for me it was the best. And not only had to do with living in the city that I was going to work and kind of not going this crazy that you are like living in a place and trying to think from another, but actually putting my body and my head and my, like everything in the same place, so I could actually think with the place at the same time. And also the nuances of how the city is, like how even going to the supermarket, like all these nuances that otherwise are like, not that you cannot get them if you go for a short period of time, but somehow you are becoming more part of it. So I was quite happy to do that. I think I'm just trying to think what both of you have said. I think the health of the organization is very, very important, because it's the one, like I'm a guest at the end of the day. So, for instance, in my case, the health of the organization it's important that has a conversation already with the city, like, or how is those conversations and what are the lacks. So when we the responsibility of a curator is understanding not only the organization, like what it is, but the relationships already built and what are the lacks and the successes, and kind of as well from there measuring. And in the case of the Liverpool Biennial, for instance, that I think makes two big difference is like if you have a building or not. We occupy other buildings, for instance. So we occupy the Tate, the Blue Coat, it's a different ecology. And the Tate as an organization is not the same as the Blue Coat, which is like a local organization, right? So it's understanding all those conversations and like how a biennial in a way try to participate on an ecology, in my case, tries to participate on an ecology that already exists. So I think for me, it has to do that the curator as well is not about imposition, but about exchange. And I think it has to do with this idea of, like I think it's an old-fashioned idea of the curator that comes with a concept and just, and it's like, I'm coming with this great idea, is much more of an exchange between all the factors and agents and things that are happening. That's kind of the reading that one does. And it's more for me like an exercise of prediction than nothing, you know, like you have to predict, you know, like kind of, and then the selection comes from those sort of analysis, if you like, you know, like, in this space, like what it would be, you know, and then you can actually create this kind of set of relationships that's what an exhibition for me is, you know, it's a set of relationships that happens in, you know, for a period of time. So what are the sets of relationships, you know? So knowing all the parameters is what will inform you. But of course, for that, you need to have a bit of time and wanting to hear, you know? So you have to be a listener. That's the things, like the curator, the idea for me in position and all that is kind of very, kind of, for me as Latin America, kind of this Western form of understanding knowledge that I'm, you know, like a little bit what you say, like coming to teach you, you know, coming to show you, you know, and it's not vertical, you know, it's not about knowledge that somebody has to, you know, that we are delivering and people have to acquire. It's much more transversal, you know, and what we create is a set of relationships, questions, ideas, and each artist with their own work do other set of relationships, you know, because we are talking all the time about us, but then the works of art, each of them are like a universe in themselves. So that's something that we have to produce a space for. So that I think is what allows you if you are kind of engaged. If not, of course, you do other type of show and maybe I would not like, or yes, you know, or like, you know, I mean, at the same time, I think ideally, we should all be different practitioners as well, you know, coming with our own set of tools, because otherwise, you know, we will reproduce the same biennials, you know, and that's also boring. So I think kind of having different set of tools and different sets of putting things up front and back, in the back and in front, you know, in how the relationship with the city can be. Can be super intense and another one can be more distant. Within years, if it's something periodic, that should be read, no?
So you mentioned something about the health of organization, and if you don't mind me asking, we all read about, you know, at least the Liverpool Biennial being under particular strain recently. I think we learned about the director leaving quite unexpectedly, some board members. So clearly there was some sort of conflict in relation to the pandemic. Is there anything that you can share about that without going sensational?
No, I think has to do less with the pandemic than it seems to. And I think what I think that the pandemic is that just, you know, because we suddenly had to first stop, and then we have to create, we have to sustain whatever we had. It was really radical, you know, we had to, you know, like suddenly, I mean, when it happened, we had no idea that this is going to last until this year. You know, we were like really without, no? So we are having to react in the moment. And then you are thinking that you're working, let's say organizationally. When you're doing a biennial, you're working with a team super intensely, you know, and it's in a crescendo. And the stress comes and, you know, and then it's like the emotions as well. So you're like, you're building up. And opening is a way as well of release, you know, if like an opening of a biennial for the team is a release of that energy you've been building, yeah? So if you have suddenly two months before this in an organization, you work, 15 people, 13 people, something like that, yes? And with a lot of deadlines, you know, tomorrow deadline, communication deadline, you're always late for everything, of course, you know, and suddenly nothing. So you either have your organization super strong and you know what to do to support those systems effective, you know, like kind of I'm talking about effectively, you know, like what is what is the role of organizations to create health as much as produce biennials between, you know, like what is our health, what our health has to do, our, you know, and I think the pandemic kind of showed that in many, you know, not only perhaps here, but in other organizations, it's like how healthy the organization was in terms of that, no? So I feel like what it happened, it was like kind of something that unfortunately it's just the pandemic was kind of maybe it happened. Maybe without the pandemic wouldn't have happened, but they just put the things into extreme. So, you know, so decisions had to be made, I think, something like that. But it's all about the health of the organizations, I think. And I think we have to, again, like Filipa mentioned it before, but, like, I think the culture of work is completely overtired, we don't get, but I think it's like maybe how we care for each other is the only thing that we have, in these uncertain times. So I think it's something that maybe the pandemic will teach us more about empathy and like how we can as well, as much as we want something, we have to keep ourselves, healthy as well, collectively speaking, like the pandemic is a collective experience. I'm saying collectively as well in that sense.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? I think Brian just invited everybody to type them in the chat, but you're also welcome to raise your hands. In the meantime, I would like to also, in relation to that, so clearly we have the strain and there are two other things that, that have been discussed in relation to health and stability of biennials and some of the solutions that people put forward. One is, there's this idea of this new localism, so that as museums, biennials also will have to focus more on local. And, and that could be actually something positive, in particularly if we connect it with what Filipa mentioned, which is more sort of decelerating, because there is definitely that acceleration that happened. And I don't think humans, obviously have limited capacity to adjust to certain things. And I think a second acceleration that we often take for granted is technology. And I think that, just thinking about all the conspiracy theories around, etc., I think one of the problems is that technological progress enabled communications without people actually fully adjusting and understanding what they're reading, what is being communicated to them, how to approach that. So I was just wondering, what is your take on the digital manifestation of exhibitions? How can the fact, can the digital supplement the materiality of the exhibition, or is that something that could actually even surpass it? Or even, some more extreme voices that I've heard actually questioning the exhibition as the main medium for dissemination of art today. Maybe it's time to move on and try something else. Any thoughts on that?
Maybe I can start on that quickly so that there's time for everyone else. I think the digital can be amazing, but it's not a copy-paste. It should not be a copy-paste in the sense, exactly in the same way that we should reinvent a mode of reading that is not copying the format of the A4 sheet and translating it to a website and thinking how a reading experience can be transformed in relation to a screen that allows you to do so many things at the same time. I think there is an amazing amount of space for us to imagine the way in which contents can be shared, can be used to broadcast ideas, to announce, to exist beyond the temporality of exhibitions. But as Manuela said, it's not about importing one thing that could not be done physically or was only shared with a much lower number of people than we were expecting and uploading it on the website. It's thinking as the website as itself a different exhibition venue. And commissioning work specifically for this work, think with artists. I think we're all going through, I am, a huge crisis of imagination. And I think we need to think together and we need to think with artists. What kind of formats can we invent that can allow for distribution and circulation of sounds, images, conversations online that are not just us trying to clumsily adapt to the digital because we cannot do things the other way. So I think there's incredible things to be done, but it's really about inventing new formats and inventing them also with those that are part of the show.
I wonder if I should jump in with a question from the audience, from our
Is there?
Yeah, from Jacqueline Koch, who's our former student. who asks in the same vein regarding ethical curating in the context of fast-paced biennials. It's hard to imagine how invited curators are making lasting exchanges with the city or institution. Before the 2-year run is done, the institution has already invited someone else. How are you thinking through the ways in which transformative change can happen, especially when at this current moment, largely due to COVID, institutions are being critiqued for the ways in which they operate internally? Are biennials the appropriate place to be thinking of this?
Just two things. Like, I think, I mean, fast pace by, I mean, like, I think, I don't know, like having 2 years to do a biennial is fast, but it's slow at the same time. I don't know how to explain it. It's like enough time to do a good research as well. But I would like to, yeah, like I think that perhaps for me would be interesting to hear what you think. If it's like a biennial per se fast, I don't know. I think it depends on the project. Maybe there are some, you know, and it doesn't have to do with the time research. I don't know. Like I think temporality is strange.
Yeah, 2 years is not that, you know, it's not that slow. And sorry, Manuela, you were done or?
Yeah. No, it's just like, I think that fast pace, because for me it is, but not, you know, it is fast, but not so much.
No, yeah, that's it. That's the point. Is like you actually have the time to do quite a lot of things. And then of course, these are seeds for further projects. Like the idea, I don't think it's, oh, I've been here and then I'm going to run away somewhere else. I mean, if it's your view as a curator, when you accept to curate a show, it's a bit sad, you know, like, and usually there's always a trace. You know, empirically, like where a curator has been curating a biennial, there's a trace because he's going to keep to work with some of the artists, or at least keep discussion with the intellectual that is brought up, etc. Like the kind of mind map, the kind of field that you explore. You were talking, Manuela, about the ethics of curating. I mean, I think it's something fairly pragmatic. Like you've done all that work, you don't want to toss it away, and then fairly organically, it's going to keep growing with time. Of course, you cannot do as much as you want, and of course, it's not, as you're right, Jacqueline, with your question, it's not institutionalized, but it can have, you know, like the possibility to become potential for future projects, and that's great to grow up very organically, and that happens actually fairly often with biennials.
Something that I would only add to that is that I would say that biennials look much faster from the point of view of a visitor than from the point of view of a curator, because there's so many that the sense of speed is, as a visitor, is like too many and too quickly. And but something that we're trying to think with Shanghai, and hopefully it will work well, is the possibility of collaborating with other institutions. Let's say for commissioning, we want to commission a work, and we're thinking about commissioning together with, or a public program to do it together with Kochi Muziris or with other, so that the production is not, what I think could also change is the sense of exclusivity. Why do we have to have a work that is only shown for the Shanghai Biennial, and we can't commission an artist to make a work that feeds into, for instance, what a museum commissioned him and another biennial, and these projects have different configurations in different places, but exist as a whole. And this, it's not answering to the speed, but it's just allowing projects to exist and have afterlives and continuations and modulations that exist beyond the duration of the project, and actually also provide a much more solid research time, logistics, and also budget for those who are making, for artists in the sense. And maybe this is something we could think more about as well, is collaborating between biennials and between organizations to feed into processes that are already set.
Sorry, Brian, say it.
No, it's just like,
maybe I'll just mention that if I think we're running low on time. I think if there are any more questions from the audience, now is the time. There's one from David. Okay, maybe Martin, I'll let you finish.
No, I mean, it was just saying that museums and biennials in general are great places to become an asset for the city, for the territory in which they are, and to allow to connect people in in institutions which feel a bit freer. And we did it in Taiwan with like 5 different universities that could experiment on formats that they could not experiment in their university, because it was easier to be experimental and to look a bit weird inside of a museum. So it's just like there's a need for consciousness about what the biennial can open in terms of a space which is a bit freer for experimentation for the existing network of other institutions, whether they're universities or NGOs, etc., that can meet and experiment within your public program, for example. That's something that is important, and that can have a possibility for long-lasting effects.
Yeah.
So we have a question also from David Suarez Mira. Very nice to see your name there, David. He says, assuming the crisis is an opportunity to put at the proscenium structural concerns about other fields like political, economic, social, and also cultural, how do you see the idea of decolonial, post-colonial, and other concepts? How should they be considered to be explored in the biennial form? In the biennial or from other approaches?
I feel like the colonial, post-colonial, and other concepts like that are not themes per se, but they enact in different ways of how the world is constituted, or what we think the work is constituted. And I think art is a very good place to, in general, depending on the practices that can put questions around what we consider ideas like colonial, post-colonial, and other concepts, but not as a theme, but actually are always there, like they are always there. And there is some practices that are actually much more articulated perhaps in what those things are. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, to begin with, we have to, for me, to begin with, if we talk about curatorial practices, we have to, if we want to talk, I will think much about how we can find methodologies that is not, again, about forms of imposition, but is forms of exchange. So, like depending if you are thinking about, if you think about colonialities as a theme, I think might be sometimes could be reductive. Whereas if you think like post-coloniality as forms of making and understanding that not all, like many different types of intellectuality can be important that are not coming from the academia as well, or like I think it's within those really broad, there is ways to talk about those things. I think it's different from museums because they collect, and usually biennials don't. It's produced more. So I think so.
With the museums also, I think there is this notion of institutional memory and some sort of quite strong story that is linear, that is permanent. So I think it's much easier to discuss those questions. I would say that, from my experience trying to understand the issues of decolonializing and post-colonial, I think it's really can be only discussed in, when you take a particular example. Otherwise, making a kind of broad umbrella statements for all biennials, it's very difficult, and I'm not sure it would be particularly productive. But it's really within the local history. Once that you work within particular local context, that's where you can extract some meaning and address it and do something with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have another question in relation to Manifesta 12. I'm just trying to address whether it was in relation to inhabitants clash. I think that was probably in relation that Manifesta, as we know, it's an itinerant biennial. So this is actually maybe interesting in light with colonialism, because this is an institution that actually moves between different cities around Europe and beyond. And the fact, and I guess we could also address the biennial form itself, that what sort of legitimacy it has to suddenly land in a location and produce something. But I think, again, this is always kind of double-edged sword, because as we know, Manifesta is always working with host institutions. So again, I'm not sure whether this kind of criticism would be entirely fair, given that they always, I would say probably 70%, if not 80% of involvement, ideas, etc., are actually grown locally over a longer period of time. I would say, yeah, sorry.
For living in Marseille, where it was happening, like they made a pretty strong effort actually of adding value to the existing fabric, and the city actually fills in a form to a request to be, you know, a candidate, I think, for Manifesta, if I'm correct. So, you know, like who's asking for the event to happen is going to shape, you know, this kind of agenda in a very important way. If it's a request from the city, it's very different than if it's, you know, like coming from another perspective as well.
I think they clearly, there was a lot of strains on Manifesta also. I think they handled it relatively well. Just to wrap up the discussion, I think, you know, for me, there's a lot of, I took 3 pages of notes, definitely a lot to process, but I think what is really interesting, you know, that I sense, you know, much more enthusiasm and optimism. I don't know if it's, you know, myself after the events yesterday in the US, you know, that really finally a changing perspective for, you know, for some light to be shed on this very dark times we live in. But I think that we can definitely see that there is something almost of a new glimpse, a new instance of institutional critique and criticism within the biennials that perhaps wasn't there, because we have been taking things for granted, and we have been taking those criticism in probably without fully kind of having time to digest them and to really process them. Well, right now we really start discussing some of those key issues, again, because we have no choice, we have to deal with them. So I'm just wondering if, you know, that there is a silver lining here, definitely. And definitely something to be said about a lot of those criticisms that have been around biennials, you know, too many pointing to the fatigue and exhaustion, again, like Filipa said, that suddenly are not that relevant anymore. I don't know if there's anything else anybody would like to ask or add before we wrap up. No, that I would like to just thank everybody. And I think this is a great discussion, beginning of a discussion, because it's all pointing, you know, to a certain paradox. I think that biennials seem to be involved with a lot of these problems, but at the same time, listening to you, we also we clearly creating a space for debate and for critically articulating those issues, and you do that in your work clearly as well. So I would like to just finish on that positive note and thank everybody, and thank the School of Visual Arts for having us and for enabling us to have that conversation. And I'm sure we're just gonna all continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
great.
Super.